those that struggle with this self-worth, it seems like they will be more prone to this overarching productivity that will be a constant toxicity. And the other one that I can see is people working so hard that they don't see it, but on the other end of the spectrum, it's where we get into burnout and disease.
I think that we need to rebrand productivity to include rest in it.
The art of being able to do something not for the outcome, but just for the process of it. Have you ever thought that maybe all of the things that you're doing or that's on your to-do list could be a little bit toxic? My guest today is none other than Isra Nasir, and she is here talking about her newest book, Toxic Productivity.
Your productivity outcomes become completely attached to your self-worth. So they are not something you do, they are you. And the pursuit of productivity is priority over everything else in your life.
Wow, that's exhausting. Hey loves, do me a quick favor and hit the subscribe or follow button wherever you are tuning into this. It helps grow the show more than you know. Thank you so much again and enjoy. Tell our listeners where you grew up and kind of what prompted you to even get into psychotherapy and even writing a book on toxic productivity.
Yeah, so I am Pakistani by background. My parents are Pakistani as well, but they moved to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia in the late 70s. And so I was born in Pakistan, but I grew up in Saudi, like from age 0, because my mom, she wanted to be with her family. So she'd go back to have children and then come back to Saudi. So raised in Saudi Arabia and then lived there till 13, kind of like in just like a little expat bubble, you know. So it was honestly, it was a very peaceful childhood. I can't say that I have too many complaints about that. And then we moved to Toronto when I was 13, and I lived in Toronto up until 7 years ago when I moved to New York. So just a lot of movement and a lot of movement between culture. And I think every time you start somewhere new, you have to kind of tap into this hustle mindset because you're trying to rebuild community, you're trying to rebuild connections, you're trying to rebuild a lifestyle, right? And so I think that's something that's kind of very much integrated into my family's culture because my parents moved very young and they were also displaced in a war when they were very young. And so there's just a lot of movement in my family, which instills a very, very hard-working culture, right? And there's a lot of benefit to it. And there's a lot of benefit to being productive. And there's a lot of joy in achieving things. But I came to a point a couple of years ago when I moved to New York, I kind of tapped into the same mindset of my parents because I was like rebuilding a whole life here. But like after 3 or 4 years of just kind of tapping into that hustle mindset of New York City, I started feeling very disengaged from my life. And the first sign of that was boredom, which is very interesting. I was doing a lot of things. I was everywhere. I was going out.
So you were busy, but you were still feeling bored.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Busy and bored is a very odd place to be in because that's when you start feeling underfulfilled. And so that is an indication that whatever you're doing is not actually feeding you back. So you're putting energy into it, but it's not coming back to you. And this is like a funny story I share. So I'm a therapist, and by training, my lens is, why are we doing the things we're doing? Like, why do I feel bad? The why behind the what. So I started doing a little bit of reading on just social motivation, human behavior, trying to understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling. At some point, I even thought I was maybe depressed, like high functioning, because I'm still showing up, but feeling disengaged. And I did like the self-assessment and, you know, I didn't really meet the criteria. So then I was like, okay, then something else is wrong. It might not be a mental illness or like a mental health condition, but something is not working in my life. And in that research and reading of articles and books and stuff came a lot of themes that I then share in the book that I ended up writing. The book is just like a summary of like my research and experience on this.
Wow. And okay, define toxic productivity for us.
Toxic productivity is when your productivity outcomes become completely attached to your self-worth. So they are not something you do, they are you. and the pursuit of productivity is priority over everything else in your life. And you are pursuing for the sake of pursuing. So it's a very unintentional pursuit. So you're just doing things because you think you should do them, because other people do them, because somebody else is telling you to do them. You feel competitive or you feel shame. And so you're just kind of in pursuit, but you don't really know why or what the intention is. And your wellness, your relationships, your health, hobbies, creativity, joy, love, all of those things become secondary. So these three things kind of happen together for us to have a very unhealthy, toxic relationship to productivity.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Years ago, when I had left my dental practice and I started to speak at different events with folks who look like us that are brown, or they're from immigrant backgrounds, and I came across all of these, they were younger, right? This was like a college gathering that I went to that I was on the panel for. And all of the students there couldn't say like why they chose pre-med or, it was like pre-dentistry, pre-med, because I was talking to the pre-health students, but they couldn't say why they chose it. It was like, oh yeah, no, I mean, that's just what I'm doing. Like what's wrong with that? And not that there's anything wrong with that for those of you who are watching this right now, but they didn't know, they didn't have the self-awareness to know, and they were just there. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how is that so rampant in our culture or of immigrant kids?
I think it's very common in immigrant culture for two reasons. And I'm going to talk about the South Asian diaspora specifically because I would say that that's my most learned area, right? But I think it can be extrapolated to other immigrant communities as well. I think certain professions have a lot more value in the back home countries, but it doesn't translate over here. So let's say if you're a doctor in Pakistan, you can potentially make a lot of money, be very stable, and there's like the social hierarchy, right? But that doesn't translate into America. You become a doctor here, you have like loads of debt. You have to grind it out as a resident. You have to grind it out working at an emerge, per diem, struggle. And you're a dentist, so like you have to hustle to get to a practice. Whereas in Pakistan, like you literally graduate and you can open a practice, right? It's not that it's easy, but it's easier. Right. And so I think like our parents sometimes come with that mindset of stability. And I think there is an association that certain professions are more connected to not ruffling any feathers, like you're kind of stable. So I think our parents' generation operate on like a survival mindset because that's what they had to do. My parents, when they moved to Canada, they were in a survival mindset. They weren't trying to thrive or find hobbies, right? They didn't have those luxuries. They didn't have that privilege. And so you just do the thing that will give you the highest ROI in terms of stability and not being dependent on people. And so I think that's really where it comes from. And then there is that social, we are collectivist cultures in general are more social comparison based. Because we are a collective unit, we want to make sure that everybody falls in line. There's a bit of safety there. And that's just kind of embedded in the cultural consciousness. Whether it's true or not anymore doesn't matter, right? Yeah. It's just something we've inherited. So we are very much always in social comparison. It's very heightened. And so I think that also plays into it. And I think finally there's a little bit more of like filial piety in collectivist culture. So we tend to have this like family hierarchies and our elders have a lot of say in what we do. And so that kind of takes away a sense of agency for South Asian youth. I work with predominantly Asian clients as a therapist. Oh, wow. I would say like at any given time, 80% of my caseload is Asian. Wow. Right.
And I think Asian like from the full diaspora.
The full, like South, Southeast, Central, and even West Asia, which is known as the Middle East. So because our family structures are the same, right? And this is something I often see a lot, is they hit this point, 25, 28 years old, and now they're just going through the motions. It's autopilot. They feel like they have a checklist lifestyle. I call it a checklist life, where you're just kind of ticking it off. And that really taps into the toxic productivity mindset.
So you're saying the checklist, like get the promotion, get the girl or the boy, get the marriage, you know, all
The
of
house,
those,
the car, you have to buy the property, you, God forbid, you rent, right? Like,
oh, right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Of course.
So,
Okay.
so that checklist lifestyle. But I always like to tell people, like, your life is bigger and more dynamic than a checklist. When we reduce our life to a checklist, we take away our like individual nuance out of it. Then we just become little clones of each other. And I just feel like people deserve so much more than that.
So I love how, and I have your book right here, and I want to just grab it because I think that for so many of us, and I'm even just, as you're sharing, I'm even thinking of, oh my gosh, I was just going, like, I was in that rat race. And I can imagine for so many people, how does one even break free from, you know, they're listening to this, they're watching this on YouTube. How do they begin to start breaking free of this idea of this kind of like running on this like matrix, the hamster wheel of life? And in chapter 2, you kind of talk about having that awareness to see where it shows up. Yeah. I don't even think I even thought of where that toxic productivity would show up in my life. So I'm so glad that you're talking about this in your book. Let's dig into it. What do you mean by that? And what are you asking readers to actually do?
Sure. I think that you can't change something that you don't know exists. So for me, the first foundational thing that we have to build is self-awareness. And the reason the checklists are so easily inherited is because it doesn't require you to think. It doesn't require you to do the work of like, what do I like? What am I good at? Right? How can I pursue something that makes me feel joy? What is joy even for me? Because we're just given this list and we have to follow it, right? So self-awareness is the first step. After self-awareness, the second step is regulation. So then you regulate your emotions, your time, your energy, your calendar. And the third, on top of that, is your habits. So we cannot make sweeping changes. You know, you can't just like decide that you're going to change your whole life. Even this book, this one singular book is not going to change your whole life. One moment can pivot your direction, but it won't necessarily change your whole life. It's the small habits every day that actually change your life. So my ask for people is that while you're reading this book, let this be an entry, like a point of entry into your own self. So there's tons of reflections in there, and I really leaned on that because that's what helped me. Asking the question of, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Why do I go out every single day? What does this give me? If it's making me feel bad, why do I keep doing it? And so those type of introspective questions help build awareness. And once you see, you cannot unsee. Like, you might become more and more aware as time goes on. But once you see one thing about yourself, it's really hard to not see it anymore. Right. So it's very powerful in that way.
Right. It's almost like the light bulb goes on and you're illuminated and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
These are all my blind spots. I can choose to ignore them.
Yeah.
But they're so bright, I have to pay attention.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple of different ways that I want to kind of take this into. There had to have been a point for you that either in your private practice of seeing 80% of your clients presenting in this way. Talk to us about self-worth and how that's tied into productivity, and was that the impetus for writing this book?
So self-worth is a very misunderstood concept. A lot of people confuse self-worth and self-esteem. So self-esteem is something that is externally achieved, right? So it's based on your achievements that are outside of you. And self-worth is how you feel about yourself inherently, just by virtue of existing. Like, so your basic human dignity, your basic human value. It has nothing to do with what you bring to the table. It has nothing to do with your skills, your role, who you are in the family, your gender, like nothing. It is just your basic value as a human being. And what happens is very early on, unintentionally, our parents, our families, and the school system connects your self-esteem to your self-worth. So you become a good girl if you get good grades. You become a good boy if you get good grades or if you excel in all of your extracurriculars. And so we learn very quickly that achievement can be bartered for acceptance. And in many families, achievement becomes currency for superiority over your siblings, getting extra privileges. So we really create achievement as a thing that we earn to get belonging from our families.
Wow. So the achievement equals the acceptance.
Yeah.
Wow. And in your book, page 59, you talk about self-betrayal. You dismiss, ignore, or avoid your emotional needs for the sake of meeting your goals. Mm-hmm. You might think to yourself, it doesn't matter what I want. What matters is what I should do. How does this play a role in the self-worth category?
What that does is when you are consistently ignoring or dismissing or invalidating yourself, you start to realize that you as a person don't matter. You only matter if you are in service of fulfilling the goal. And a lot of times the goal is somebody else's. So we might think that the goal is ours, but it's a goal we have inherited because it makes us feel good in somebody else's eyes. We match up to our peers. Our parents might be really proud of us. Those things are important, but they should be secondary, right? The goal should be yours primary. And when you invalidate your needs in service of somebody else's goals, you're telling yourself that you actually don't matter. Your discomfort doesn't matter. Your happiness doesn't matter. And the more you think like that, the more it erodes at your own value in your own eyes. And that's why I use the term self-betrayal. It's like a very heavy word, right? And I don't know if a lot of people actually think about it like that, but in its essence, it is that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're leaving yourself. You're just, for the sake of what I should do, for the sake of showing face for the family or the expectation or the thing that I'm just going to be on autopilot and the robot. So what tends to happen then when somebody has that self-awareness and they're starting to question in all the ways they are betraying themselves? What have you seen?
The most common path that people take is of overcorrection. So if you come from a place of just doing what you're told, living under the pressure of I should do this, and self-betrayal, the moment you get a little bit of awareness, people kind of like overcorrect to this spectrum, right? And
they're like, forget about it. I'm not going to any family party.
Exactly.
I'm not doing anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so you kind of become this very rigid person on this side, and that can also be very alienating. I do think that there's nothing wrong with that, because the point is for you to come back to center. And you might not know your center unless you go to the other side, unless you go to the other end of the spectrum. But it is a very painful journey to leave that part of you who just wants to please everybody, who craves external applause or validation. It's very painful to leave that side and overcorrect, but people do overcorrect. And a lot of times I get well, this just kind of blew up in my face. Like, why did we do this? And then you kind of help guide people back to center. And so it is a journey.
It's almost like when somebody is thinking about, establishing boundaries for the first time, and then they're like, I'm just going to say no to everything. And then you realize, well, okay, it's only hurting yourself if you're going to self-isolate like that.
Exactly. And I think, with the boundary stuff, it's a really big part of getting out of this mindset. Another thing that happens is when people overcorrect, they think that saying no is the only boundary, right? That's the only way you can set a boundary, is just to say a flat out no. And when you come back to center, you realize that healthy boundaries are flexible, they're a conversation, they are evolving, right? No doesn't have to be the only way you set a boundary. You can offer an explanation, you can offer an alternative, and all of that is part of healthy boundary setting. But when you're coming from a place of like really not knowing where your boundary is, the only thing that feels safe is to say no.
Yeah, you talk about here as well those who potentially may struggle with low self-worth. They might have self-doubt and the people pleasing and the indecisiveness, the imposter syndrome, the perfectionism, the productivity dysmorphia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Productivity dysmorphia. That is my defense mechanism. I definitely feel it a lot. And productivity dysmorphia is essentially when you are extremely productive, but you actually don't see it like that. So you're not able to evaluate how productive you really are. Even though you might have metrics, you might have goals, you might have like things that you check off, it doesn't feel good.
Oh, it's never going to be good enough.
It's never good enough. It's never enough. It's never done properly. You just weren't productive. Like when I was writing this book, I would write for 5 hours, okay? And of those 5 hours, let's say maybe 2 hours worth of material was not good. We're not using it in the manuscript. I would still be like, God, today was not a good day. I just had a bad working day because I didn't write for 8 hours. And the days I would be on my laptop for 8 hours, I was like, today was not a good day because I didn't really do anything else, right? So you just have this like very distorted perception, and there's a big gap between reality and how you're viewing your time and your output. It's a very confusing place.
Yeah. So for those that struggle with this self-worth, it seems like they will be more prone to this overarching productivity that will be a constant toxicity. And wow, that's exhausting.
Yeah, because you know what happens is when you struggle with low self-worth, let's say just foundationally or something has happened in your life that has kind of brought you feeling a little down, productivity is the fastest way to get like a little bit of a dopamine hit that makes you feel good. And so what happens is we start using productivity habits as a coping skill to feel good. And over time, we delude ourselves into thinking that, oh, this is the way to feel good, because that loop becomes so fast, right? You complete something and you get this feeling of accomplishment and achievement. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with feeling good about your achievements. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue achievement. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be ambitious. I'm not even saying that we shouldn't be productive. What the point is that it cannot be the only thing that makes you feel good, and it cannot be the primary thing that makes you feel good. So you have to find ways to see yourself as a whole person that includes your achievements and includes your relationships and includes your hobbies and includes your interests and your passions. And so thinking about yourself in this way is a really, really helpful way to kind of diversify where you feel good. And that's a way to also build up your self-worth.
What has been the mission for this book, and what do you hope readers will take away?
My mission for this book is I want people to know that there are other ways of being successful and ambitious and productive that don't have to make you feel bad. Because in my experience, when I was overwhelmed and disconnected and stressed out, I believed at that time that that was a natural byproduct of being an ambitious person. Like, if you're not stressed, you're not ambitious.
Right, or you're not working hard enough,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Like, you know, I just felt like that was a normal way of being. And if I wasn't stressed, then I'm not doing something right. And so I want people to change that mindset. And our culture, not just South Asian culture, but culture at large, really promotes that idea. You have to be frazzled. And if you're not frazzled, then you're not working hard enough.
Oh.
And so that is my mission. I want people to realize that there is a way to be sustainably productive over a long period of time that is not going to impact your health and your wellness. And I want to start building a collective awareness that it's important to look inwards. Because, you know, as a therapist, that's my one and only job, is to help people become more introspective. And so I just want more people to be self-reflective.
Well, and the other one that I can see is people working so hard that they don't see it, but on the other end of the spectrum, it's where we get into burnout and disease. And so how often, how are you working with your clients? What is like the number one or two instances that you see, or the things that keep coming up in your clients today that you're solving for?
I think a lot of people have a hard time saying no. That is a most common thing that comes up. People get very uncomfortable. They don't know how to manage that discomfort of like disappointing somebody or the fear of missing out. And so reactively, people just say yes to things. And helping people develop that skill of saying no and being comfortable, regulating their emotions, creating some distance, I think has been a really big part of it. And especially with like the Asian diaspora young people, is helping them become comfortable with disappointing their parents. And I think that that is a very scary thing for people. But I think it's a really important part of individuation, which is the healthy separation between parent and child when we are developing our identity, right? And that doesn't mean to be disrespectful to your parents, right? It doesn't mean to disregard them or neglect them, but it is important to be okay with disappointing them. And that's a very big ask. As an Asian woman myself, I'll tell you, it's been definitely a hard journey. And sometimes my mom listens to these things.
Aww,
and
hi, Auntie.
but anytime I talk about this, she's always like, oh, what are you teaching these young people to disappoint your parents? But I do think that it's an important part of the journey.
And to your point, you know, to be able to brave these difficult conversations, because what I see on the other end, I think when you're 20s, you're all about finding your friends and your crew. And then 30s is like, or the end of, you know, the Saturn return cycle. But like in your 30s, it's all about the individuation. Yeah. And so to your point, I think a lot of us, you know, myself included, it's like you fully overcorrect because you've never had boundaries before. And so now it's like this over saying no, but then you haven't learned how to have these beautiful, difficult conversations. Yeah. And then, you know, in your 40s or when you start to have children, then you're like, oh, I think I need my family again. Yeah. I think I need them. I want them to be in my kid's life. Yeah. So you talk about your inner critic. Let's unpack that. Because for a lot of the goal-getting folks that even listen to the Brave Table, this inner critic loud voice can be so strong.
Absolutely. And the impact of the inner critic makes me realize how powerful our thoughts are. And the thing that I think about a lot is how can we actually leverage that power for better? So if the critical voice makes you feel a certain way, then just by virtue of the impact our thoughts have, the gentle voice should also have the same magnitude of impact, right? And so I think it's really important for us to leverage that. The inner critic is a mixture of everything that we have been taught. So it doesn't always have to be your parents, but for sure your primary caregivers, their voices in your head, teachers, like you've often maybe seen videos of like, or when people win awards or like my drama teacher told me to quit, right? Like that person 40 years later still has that voice in their head that somebody told me to quit 40 years ago. So it is an amalgamation of various messages that you've received. However, it has its own character. So everybody's inner critic has a specific character. And I think it's really important for us to become aware of that. And that's the exercise I do with a lot of people is let's do a character summary of your inner critic. Like, who is this person?
Oh, okay. So you go into like, how, like what they look like, what their name is.
Totally. You know, we literally do character summaries the way you would for like a movie script. Ooh. And I remember this one person drew their inner critic once and they gave their inner critic like very pointy hair. And they described to me why. And they said, it's because my inner critic is very hurtful. Everything about my inner critic is sharp. And so it shows up in any which way. Somebody made a PowerPoint deck of their inner critic, like just talk me through it, like a presentation. Other people like write out stories, but really understanding who your inner critic is helps you understand when they come up. Because what happens is we cannot differentiate between our inner critic and our thoughts. So we think that our inner critic is us. So I am this person who is being mean to myself. The truth is, it is a voice, a set of thoughts. And by giving it a character, you separate it from yourself.
Right. So it isn't you. It's not part of you.
Yeah.
It's just It's a voice.
It's a voice. It's a thought. And so what that does is it gives you this cognitive distance. And that distance is so important because that's the place where you enter in with some regulation skills. And so the voice becomes lower and lower and lower. And frankly, the truth is, and people hate hearing this, the truth is the inner critic will never go away because it is embedded so foundationally in our thoughts. But our gentle inner coach is also there. It's just the volume is low and the inner critic volume is high. So what we have to do is turn down the critic and turn up the coach. And what happens is I often hear people say to me, oh, I was doing so well. And then I just had I had a bad date and all of the same thoughts from before came up. Like, I can't believe I'm still at the place where I was when we started. And I always say, you know what? It will come up. But this time you were stronger.
Right.
This time you were able to kind of withstand it, push back, or really coach yourself in a gentle way. And I think that's what healing is.
Yeah. And with healing, it's like, right, this always unraveling onion that we have.
Yeah.
And well, what do you say about then those triggers that come up in session with the same clients?
So triggers are like really interesting because people want them to go away. Triggers are also not going to go away. And I think we as compassionate people around the people we love can be really mindful and maybe alert somebody of triggers or just hold space for them. But the reality is we are responsible about our reactions to triggers. That's like my ownership. That's my piece to own. And that's where we build a lot of resilience and self-confidence, that our triggers are not going to overwhelm us. And so that's why it's really important to be aware of your triggers, not so that you avoid them, because avoiding any kind of trigger for a long time actually takes away your skill to confront it. And so even when we, let's say, for example, work with people who have severe phobias, over time, the point is to expose them to their phobia in small doses. It's called exposure therapy. Because if you avoid the trigger completely forever, you will never build the skill to confront it and to withstand it. But you have to do it in small ways, right? So when triggers come up for productivity, like getting on Instagram and seeing somebody else get something, right? And you're like, damn, like, why don't I have this? Like, I should have it. I should be working harder.
Oh, this comparison.
Yeah.
Right? They see the fancy car or the fancy house or the fancy.
Or anything, travel, relationship status, anything, right? And so the trigger is, okay, now I know my trigger. It's when I see somebody else. So what do I do then? And that's the plan you kind of create. I create with my clients is like, what do you do in that moment? And the first step to trigger management is being in your body, because you have to kind of regulate the emotions, the physiological reaction you're having, so that you can actually then talk yourself through the difficult moment.
Wow. You talk in chapter 5, I love this so much, about managing unresolved shame. How is that related to our toxic productivity and our self-worth?
Shame is an emotion that tells you that you are wrong. In comparison, guilt is an emotion that tells you did something wrong. So guilt is an action-oriented emotion, whereas shame is an emotion that sits inside of you, telling you to be smaller and smaller and smaller because you are wrong. You are bad. And what happens in the toxic productivity mindset is when we are comparing ourselves, or someone is like, our inner critic is making us feel bad for not being good enough, the shame starts kind of creating this little silo around you where you become really disconnected. And in order to feel better, you just start moving. You just unintentionally, no thought, there's no direction, there's just motion. You just start doing things because you're trying to feel better. And the biggest problem with shame is that shame is used to motivate us when we're younger. Teachers, coaches, parents, it's well-meaning people. It's not because they're trying to be mean, right? But it is a very commonly used tool of discipline.
Can you give us examples?
When somebody drops a glass, like your child drops a glass, instead of saying you did something bad, a lot of parents reactively will say, oh, like, you're such a bad boy, you're such a bad girl, right? Or if you don't get good grades, or if you didn't do well at the recital, I think it just becomes this like good and bad binary, right? Or comparing you to other people's kids.
Oh, yeah, that's the worst.
Yes, yeah.
I still get that, and I'm in my 4th decade of life.
Yeah. And so again, but that is like a way to internalize shame in somebody else. That person is so good. We're so proud of them. If you could only be like them. And so you're like, wait, I'm bad because I didn't do this thing. And what happens is shame will really help us get moving because it's so uncomfortable, right? You just start doing whatever that needs to be done to feel good. And so people really confuse shame as like a positive motivation.
Ooh. And where does it get sticky in the shame, where you're carrying all of those things that you were penalized for, disciplined for as a child, now as an adult? How does it show up in their relationships? How does it show up in their work environment?
Shame will show up everywhere when you are making yourself small. When you feel like your voice is not worthy of having anybody hear it, when you feel like the things you do are not good enough, so you don't talk about it. We carry shame with us without even knowing it. It is such a insidious emotion. And if you are the kind of person who everybody describes as just being so go with the flow. Oh, you're so chill. You are so easy. A lot of that is the shame of not wanting to take up space, right? And so what happens is you want to find balance. Of course, you don't want to be the person who is difficult. At the same time, the people who do take up space are immediately labeled difficult. And then you have the shame and you kind of retract back. And I think what happens is shame gets you moving, right? It gets you started, but because there's no longevity to shame, like the motivation that you get from it, you become really mean to yourself and you put yourself down. When we self-select ourselves out of the running, oh, I'm not going to apply to this. I'm not going to get it. Other people are better than me. What's the point even of going on the date? That's shame telling you, you're not good enough. Just step out of the race. You're not ready yet. A lot of people will say, oh, you're not ready. I'm not ready yet. Not yet. But they've been in the role for 5 years, right? They've got so many awards, but they're still like, I'm not ready yet to be a manager. That's shame telling you you're just not good enough. So when you're holding yourself back, that's kind of shame operating way back, like in the darkness. Shame is just pulling the strings and leading you to believe that you're just not worthy. It's not going to happen for you. And it's a really painful place to be in.
What is your hope for people getting this book? What do you want them to take away?
I want them to understand that in order to be more productive, in order to be more successful, whatever that means for you, the first and most important skill before organization, before time management, before any kind of hack, the most important skill is understanding your emotions and being able to regulate them. Because our emotions are such strong drivers of our behavior, and we just don't pay enough attention to it, right? So with the book, I'm kind of coming in as a little bit of a small challenger to the discourse on productivity. Because everywhere you look, everyone's like, here's a life hack, here's a productivity hack, here's a rule you can use, here's a system you can make, and all of these behavioral changes will make you more productive. And while they will make you more productive when things are good, those systems will fall apart when things become challenging. Because when we get stressed, our behavior falls to the side and our emotions really take over. So being able to acknowledge your emotions, understand what they're saying, where they're coming from, and regulating them in a healthy way will make you so much more productive in the long run.
Yeah, and I loved your book, and I love the title of it because I feel like it's just, it's giving people permission. And I think the younger version of myself was on that rat race, on the kind of like, let's go. And there's a chapter in your book talking about rest and rejuvenation. And I feel like in this era, I am savoring the slow. And I'm just savoring the slow, and I cannot tell you in reading, the chapter on rest and rejuvenation, the amount of things that are just coming to me, like from opportunities or just serendipitous events, and it's just in flow and ease. And I never, ever, ever would have thought that. And this idea, well, in this world that we're like, hustle, 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 let's go, let's go, let's go. What advice do you have for people who can't even get themselves to think that rest and rejuvenation is a positive thing?
I think that we need to rebrand productivity to include rest in it. That's but part of my mission here is to reimagine the definition of productivity. Because what's happened is we have taken rest out and put it outside of doing and work, and it's become something we have to earn. You work enough to get the vacation hours, right? You do your chores, then you get to play with your friends, like when you're a child, all of those things. So what happens is rest becomes this thing that we want to earn. But what I'll say to people who cannot even fathom this is I want them to do like an imagination exercise and think about what happens if they get sick. When you get sick, your productivity will be at zero.
Yep.
If you're an entrepreneur and you're not well, your revenue is going to get impacted, right? If you are the CEO and you get sick, like I think Ariana Huffington shared the story, right? She wasn't sleeping very well. She was trying to make Huffington Post into a thing. And then she collapsed in her office and she hit her face at the corner of a table. She was just lying there on the floor because nobody was there, bleeding from her head, just wondering how she came to this point in her life, right? And that was the impetus for her to start, I think, Sleep Revolution. But that's the thing, right? When she wasn't well, HuffPost was not well. And so I think it's really important to think about rest as a very integral part of your productivity, a part of the hustle, and really thinking about how when you are joyful, your creativity is better, right? So when you think about rest, you have to think about rest as making you better overall. So whatever it is that you're worried about, you're not going to get if you're not resting. And I really want people to think about that. The second thing I really want people to think about is doing nothing is not enough. Because what happens is when we do nothing, a lot of times we leave that space of nothingness not feeling refreshed, because like a plant, we need to be feeding our souls. And that's why I say rest and rejuvenation come together. And it doesn't have to be very complicated. It doesn't need to be like an expensive vacation. It can literally be something that you do just for the sake of doing it, just for the joy of doing it. It has no achievement associated with it. And I think puzzles are a really good analogy for this.
Yeah.
Because you make them to break them. You put in hours of work, you're just kind of chilling, trying to find the pieces to put together, and you're just doing, you have to break them. You can't keep framing every puzzle you make. And so I find making puzzles to be a really good exercise for my clients who can't slow down.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah,
because Brave Table Fam.
Yeah, because it engages your brain.
Puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're creatively engaged, you're tactically engaged, right? And because you're doing something tactically, your mind is decompressing and processing, but you have to break it in the end.
The art of being able to do something not for the outcome, but just for the process of it.
Yeah.
This is all so good, and there was something that I wanted to share around this, this rest and rejuvenation. It'll come back to me, but where can we get the book? Because I think that in all, this is a permission slip. And I feel like for so many people, we have to reframe this whole idea of from the immigrant kind of standard, the immigrant hustle for their kids, first generation, second generation. I think it's reframing laziness, because if we're not productive, then what are we?
Yeah.
And I know that so often and this is what I'm hearing, kind of the through line from our conversation, is how can we normalize play, and can we be okay and still be as productive even when we are taking rest, even when we are savoring the slow, even when we are not tying our worth to kind of the outcome and the productivity. So I'm so glad that you have this in a book, because I think for a lot of people that, you know, the whole idea is, am I going to be what does laziness even mean? Or what does the word lazy mean if I'm not productive? Because it's the complete opposite of productivity.
Yeah.
Which is obviously not in that immigrant hustle mentality, because when your immigrant parents are coming to this country, they cannot be lazy. They cannot not work.
Yeah.
And then they're passing that rhetoric down to the kids. So I'm so glad you are paving the way to really reshape our next generation of people, humans that are going to get so much value from this book. So where can we get it?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. I didn't even think about it like that in terms of the impact it can have on coming generations. So that was very humbling that you said that. Thank you. You can buy this book everywhere books are sold. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all of the things. But if you go to my website, which is isranasir.com, on the book page, you'll have all of the information. And if you get it before November 19th, there's some fun bonus content. So the chapter on guilt and a full chapter on burnout, as well as worksheets and a book club that I'll be leading.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And is this under Well Guide? Because you're a Well Guide on Instagram.
Well.guide.
Well.guide.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, congratulations on your mission.
Thank you.
And I think so many people are going to be just enamored by this book. It is a quick read, everyone. So go ahead and grab the book where books are sold. You can go to IsraNasir.com. Amazing. Thank you so much for pouring into our community. We always end the show with a couple of rapid fire questions. You ready to play?
Sure.
All right. Okay. Chai or coffee?
Coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like for necessity, like I have to have it every day.
Okay.
Chai is a luxury treat. I love chai, but coffee is mandatory.
Favorite morning routine?
Silence.
Favorite book that you're reading?
I'm reading all fours right now, but I think my favorite book in contemporary times has been Garden by the Sea. Yeah, it's a Spanish book that was translated into English. It's really beautiful.
Garden by the Sea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One word that describes this season of life?
I feel like I'm in a transformation. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for pouring into our community. And I hope that the whole tour is super nourishing, because I know that so many people are going to be so excited to have this book, Isra.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Until next time on the Brave Table. Welcome back to the other side. Oh my goodness, you guys, toxic productivity, reclaim your time and emotional energy in a world that always demands more. This couldn't be a more appropriate title. And so if you are thinking of what's the book that you want to bring into your school or your organization, or even in your work with your team, in your family, let's reframe productivity. And Isra is doing this. So go ahead and connect with her at well.guide. She's well.guide on Instagram. You can go ahead and grab her book. I will link her website in the show notes, and you want to grab those juicy, amazing bonuses as well. And if you haven't already, and you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on Spotify, on iTunes, go ahead and click the like button, subscribe button, follow button. It helps us grow the show more than you know. And if you want to go into healing and figuring your patterns, or maybe your generational traumas, or maybe even going into what trauma really means for you, go ahead. There are 3 additional episodes in the show notes to help you reparent yourself. And if you haven't already, share this with a bestie, a friend, a teacher, a guide, somebody in your life that could use the tools to be just a little bit more brave. What are you waiting for? Go ahead and share this episode with them. Let us know below in the comments what you loved about this episode. Tag us on Instagram. We are at the Brave Table at Neeta Bhushan. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is my honor and guide and pleasure to guide you every week. Until next time, I will see you soon.